Pulumi. Should you use it? It makes no sense to me. Go or Java or JavaScript, Python, what's not? No obvious benefit as far as I can tell. I'm not sure about that. Since the beginning, infrastructure as code or configuration management tools, that's how we called them in the past, relied on the idea that we define infrastructure either in a declarative format, YAML or JSON or XML even, or in a domain-specific language or a DSL. So Chef was DSL, Puppet was DSL, Terraform is DSL as well, Ansible is YAML, and so on and so forth. So from that aspect, all the tools follow the same ideas, except one. A group of people decided that infrastructure as code is better off if defined through general purpose languages like Go or Java or JavaScript, Python, what's not. The same languages that you use to develop everything else, like your applications, backend, frontend, what's not. And the result of that idea is a project called Pulumi. It is a infrastructure as code type of tool that uses general purpose language. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Is this just trying to be different? Let's start by exploring Pulumi in 20 minutes or less, and then after that we'll discuss whether all that makes sense and if it does, in which cases it does or it doesn't. Let's see. But first, let's go through the tool itself. A few notes before I start showing you how all that works. To begin with, I installed already Pulumi CLI, the instructions how to install it, and everything else that I will do today is in a gist, and gist is in the description. So go there, open the link, and if you want to follow along or just consult it. Since Pulumi manages infrastructure, I had to choose some place to run it, to use it, to show you how it works. And that place today is Google Cloud, so I will run examples in Google Cloud for a simple reason, because I couldn't really create a demo that will work in every single infrastructure. I mean, theoretically, I could do in parallel Google Cloud and AWS and Azure and what's not, but hey, I will use Google Cloud. That does not mean that you have to use it with Google Cloud. It's just that examples had to be somewhere, and I happen to use Google Cloud today. And for that, I created a project in Google, and everything else I will do today is going to start from scratch. So I have only the project in Google created in advance. Do not worry if you're scared with the word Google Cloud because you prefer AWS, Azure. Everything I'm showing you works in a similar way everywhere. Now, syntax, of course, is different depending on the providers, but the logic is exactly the same. So it doesn't matter where your infrastructure is. Now let's create a new project, and for that we will need a directory, and I will create a directory called TMP because I'm not creative, and go inside of that directory, and there we are. Now Pulumi new, that's where we start. So let's check what we have over there. What can be new project in Pulumi terms? It can be many different things. We can see here that we have Alibaba, AWS, Azure, DigitalOcean, Equinix. I do not know even what Equinix is, probably bare metal something. Anyways, GCP, Kubernetes specific, Linode, and so on and so forth, right? So we have different locations or different providers supported directly out of the box with Pulumi. And for each of those, we can choose the language we want to use. We can use C#, F#, Go, JavaScript, Python, TypeScript, Visual Basic, right? The supported languages are similar across the board, but not necessarily implemented for every single provider. So for example, we can see that for DigitalOcean, there is no F#, C#, only Go, JavaScript, Python, and TypeScript, right? So which languages are provided for which provider depends from case to case. Now, I will output the project ID because I will need it later. There we are. And I will create a new project. By the way, the first project ID was for Google Cloud, and now we're creating Pulumi project. So Pulumi, new, and I will use GCP Go. So Google Cloud Platform Go is the language. Also, if you're scared by the word Go, Golang, it's the same for JavaScript, Python, just different syntax, right? But the logic is the same, as long as your language is supported. So the project name, I will use the project called TMP, why not? And description, whatever is the default description, and the stack name will be, let's keep dev. Now, I need the ID of Google project so that it knows where to create whatever it needs to create. So I will paste that. And that's about it. We have a new project, and as the instructions say, we can do Pulumi up, and then it would create whichever resources are missing, or it will update resources. It will do whatever needs to be done to converge the desired state, which is in this case expressed through Go code, and the actual state, which in this case is Google Cloud. Now, the result of all that is that we got a file main.go, and here we have the description of what our infrastructure should look like. A few imports like, hey, we want to work with storage, we want to work with Pulumi, typical imports, and then we have Pulumi run. Basically, this is the function that will be executed whenever we say Pulumi up, and it will create a new bucket. It will return an error if there is an error, and then it will export that bucket to a variable that we can reference later, right? This is the simplest possible example of infrastructure with Pulumi. We are just creating a single bucket. Now, this is too simple. I do not want to go to very complicated examples, but this is too simple for us to see what Pulumi can do. So I will delete what we just created with Pulumi stack rm for remove dev. So let's start over and do it a bit better. So I prepared already a repo with a slightly better example, not necessarily a complex example, but better than this one, just one storage. Come on, that's too simplistic, right? So I will go to Pulumi demo directory. This is a repository. You can clone it on your machine if you want to get the same source code. And before I dive into the source itself, I will create a Pulumi config set. So I will set GCP project variable basically to be whatever is my project ID so that Pulumi knows with which project to work. And it is asking me, hey, do you want to create a new stack? And I just realized that I did not really explain what the stack is. To explain what the stack is, actually, we should understand how the state is stored in Pulumi. And state is stored in cloud, at least by default. So whatever we do, that information is pushed to Pulumi Cloud, and we need a unique identifier for a group of resources, and that unique identifier or a group of resources is called stack. So I will create a new stack, and I will call that stack dev. And there we are. And now Pulumi knows that that specific Google project should be used for that stack. Now let's take a look at the source code, slightly better than the one we get with Pulumi new. So this will create a GKE cluster, Google Kubernetes Engine cluster in Google Cloud. And here is the definition. We can see here that we are importing a few libraries. That's okay. I'm defining a few variables. Variables could be defined in an external file, but I somehow feel that if I'm using Go, it should be actually part of the source code, so that's my preference. Anyways, instead of hard coding everything, the things that are potentially changeable, I tend to define as variables so that I can easily, hey, if I want to change the machine type, I can just change the variable here instead of hunting it throughout the code. Now within Pulumi Run, we are starting by enabling certain APIs in Google, and that's a new service, containergoogleapis.com. This is a requirement from Google side. If we want to use a service, we need to enable its API first. Next, I'm trying to figure out which Kubernetes version I want to use. So I have a variable KTS version, which is by default empty. And here there is a small logic that says, hey, if the variable is empty, then find the latest version and use that one. If it's not empty, just do nothing, right? So it's an if-and statement that might actually prove to be a good thing within Pulumi, because this is Go. It could be JavaScript or something else, but general languages allow us to create conditionals in a much better and easier way than potentially using DSL, or maybe not. It really depends. We'll see later. And then comes the important part. I'm creating a new cluster, and then for that cluster specifying some variables, some properties, like, hey, this is the location I want to run it, this is the master version we want to use, the remove default node pool, what is the initial count of nodes, and then we have the node pool that has some other attributes, and so on and so forth. Now, what would be interesting is to compare this with the equivalent definition in, let's say, Terraform. But I will not do that today, Today I want to go only through Pulumi in isolation, and then in one of the next videos I will compare Pulumi with Terraform and maybe a few other tools, and then we can see them side by side and see what really makes more sense. But for now I'm exploring Pulumi in isolation, and this is the syntax we are using. It's just typical Go code. Now, if you are already using Terraform, you will notice that this is almost the same, because both Pulumi and Terraform are based on the same Google API, so the properties are the same. The major difference is that we are using Go constructs in this case to define things. It must be Pulumi string ptr location, right? So we need to comply with whatever is the Pulumi way of doing things, plus to comply with whatever is Go specific way to do things. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure yet. We'll discuss it later. And then we export kubeconfig, because obviously when I create a Kubernetes cluster, I need to configure kubeconfig to access the Kubernetes API of the newly created cluster, and so on and so forth. And for this, I have a new function, generate kubeconfig, which is below here. And it is just a template, right, that will output this long, big string with few values replaced. Normally, I would not do this, because this is horrible. This is really bad. I would probably use gcloud, execute command gcloud this and that will fetch the config for me. But as far as I know, in Pulumi, we cannot actually execute commands from Go code, which is a bummer, which is a bit silly. Actually, there is an issue. I will link the issue to that specific thing, the problem, in the description section. For now, just remember that as far as I know, and I might be wrong, we cannot execute commands, so we need to do silly things like this. There is also a way to deploy our applications, and I intentionally commented it because I think it's silly. But before I actually start claiming it's silly, let's take a look how we would create a Kubernetes deployment, and this is basically it. This is now using Go code and Pulumi syntax to define equivalent of deployment YAML. This is the namespace, this is the selector, the number of replicas, the template, and so on and so forth. And this is actually example copied and adapted from the official quick start or something like that. But this is the silliest thing that one can do. How is this better, more useful, or how does this even make sense compared to a typical Kubernetes YAML for defining, in this case, deployment? It makes no sense to me. We can discuss whether it makes sense or not to use Pulumi to define infrastructure, but why would I do this instead of just having a YAML file, or maybe Helm template, or customizer, what's or not? Makes no sense to define application manifests like this. No obvious benefit as far as I can tell. So I will ignore the ability or the examples to define Kubernetes manifests and to deploy stuff and focus on infrastructure only. And infrastructure is this, right? In the next video, and subscribe, actually that's important, subscribe to the channel if you want to see a comparison between Pulumi and Terraform, because it's coming. I will probably include a few others in the mix, but for now, that's what it is. We use Go combined with Pulumi libraries to define infrastructure in an imperative way, right? So this is not really declarative. Declarative would be Terraform HCL or YAML for Ansible or what's or not. This is imperative. Go code could be some other type of code. So let's create the cluster, create the infrastructure defined in Pulumi. Pulumi up, UP. There we are. It is giving us a live preview. I will jump to it soon, but before that, let's see what is it asking us. Do we want to perform this update? Yes, no, and details. Details give us information of what will happen if we apply this change, and we have yes, I want to do the update. And then I can see the live action through the UI. Let's open it very quickly, right? Pulumi is streaming the information from us to them, so everything is available in cloud and I can access it. So let me log in first. There we are. and we can see now what is happening live through the UI as well. Basically, it is the same information we get from console, so I will go back to console. That's funnier than basic. Yeah, it's the same. No big difference between this and what we are seeing in the console. So let's go back. It will take 5, 6, 7 minutes, something like that, until cluster is created. That's on Google, right? Not really thought of Pulumi. So I will fast forward to the end of the process. And that's about it. The cluster is created. Now we can use it. We can modify the definition, go to main, go and modify something and then execute Pulumi up again and so on and so forth. Now let's destroy what we created. That will give me opportunity for two things. First of all, to show you that we can not only create and update, we can destroy stuff. So Pulumi destroy, and then just follow the instructions. And instructions will ask me, hey, do you want to perform this destroy? Yes, I do. And that's about it. Now it's deleting everything. Now let's talk about Pulumi. Let's see, is it any good and what it's good for? So Pulumi, should you use it? I don't know, to be honest. But let's start with the positive things. Docs are absolutely awesome. They have clear examples, clear documentation, but then there is a problem of quantity. If we compare it with Terraform, there are less examples, less docs, less of everything, less modules community built, and so on and so forth. But that is normal because Terraform exists for many more years than Pulumi, so we cannot expect the same level of quantity of everything as in Terraform. That shouldn't be a big deal as long as what Pulumi offers is what you need and you don't need to go beyond that. But even that might not be true, because even if Pulumi gives you what you need, if you need to create X, whatever X is, you will easily find thousands of examples from different repos, gists, docs, different places for Terraform, and way fewer for Pulumi. But I cannot blame Pulumi for that, simply it is a newer project than Terraform. Community is smaller, libraries are fewer, and so on and so forth. It's to be expected. One cool thing about Pulumi is the state. It pushes the state to Pulumi SaaS, Pulumi Cloud, so you don't need to worry about storing state somewhere, which is always a bit of an annoying thing with Terraform. You need to create a drive, you need to make sure that you back it up, you need to make sure that state is always available, because you cannot assume that state is what Terraform created on your laptop. That's just silly, right? It needs to be in some shared space that other people working with you can access. The major difference between Pulumi on one hand and the rest of similar tools on the other is in a way how we define the desired state of our infrastructure. Almost everybody else assumes that you prefer working with YAML or with DSL. Many other tools created their own domain-specific language, so even if it's not directly YAML or HCL like in Terraform case, you have some semblance of programming, but based on domain-specific language that is tailored for the needs of that tool. And that is a double-edged sword, because you need to learn the DSL, but DSL on the other hand should work better, assuming that it is tailored for the needs of infrastructure. The real question is whether you want to define your infrastructure in a declarative format or in an imperative format using a programming language, common programming language, general programming language like Go, JavaScript, what's not. From my perspective, when we define infrastructure, there are declarative parts of it, and there are some loops and conditionals and what's not that are better described in imperative format using any programming language. If you go to Terraform, defining conditional statements is silly, complicated, not really that user-friendly and not so obvious. On the other hand, I could also argue that vast majority of what we define are not imperative things, are not loops and conditionals, but simply, hey, this is the statement of what I need. I want this, and those are the arguments. I want that, and those are the arguments. Very declarative way of defining. Even if you go to Pulumi itself and check the quick starts or the docs, you will see that vast majority of examples in Pulumi themselves are not using the features that are potentially better off using a programming language, but are really declarative statements translated into a programming language, and that feels kind of weird. The situation is that there are almost always declarative and imperative things involved in writing the manifests or defining our infrastructure, and the real question is whether we have more of one or the other. And I tend to believe that if you cannot define majority of what you need in a declarative way, no matter the language, no matter the syntax, you're probably doing your infrastructure in a strange or a weird way. That might be a smell of something being wrong rather than a pattern that we should apply to the tooling that we are using. But that aside, you might be the person who simply doesn't like YAML, doesn't like HCL, and in that case, Pulumi is great. Hey, you want everything to be written in Go, in TypeScript, in Python, what's or not? Excellent. That's where Pulumi shines. It allows us to avoid YAML. But is that realistic? Almost everything else is in YAML, and I'm not going to switch from Helm to Pulumi. I'm not going to switch from Customize to Pulumi, and so on and so forth. Everything else that is not necessarily well suited for type of tasks that Pulumi does is defined in a declarative format. So it feels kind of strange that, hey, I'm going to use declarative format for my, let's say, Kubernetes manifests, but infrastructure should be defined through a general purpose code. And then we see examples like the one I showed that was commented where, hey, you can use Pulumi to define Kubernetes deployment. That shows even more how not well suited Pulumi is as a replacement for your declarative statements of things. I would strongly suggest that if you do choose Pulumi, stick with infrastructure only. Don't enter into the rest of what you're having in your build scripts and your deployment manifests and so on and so forth. That is extending boundaries way beyond what you probably should be doing. Now, one thing where Pulumi shines is testing, and the reason is relatively simple. If what you define is in Go or JavaScript or what's or not, then writing tests for that something is so much easier than if your manifests are in a declarative format, and tests are obviously not going to be in declarative format. You need code for that, and that combination might sound a bit over the top. So for testing, Pulumi shines. But that could be the only thing where I see Pulumi has a real advantage towards other solutions. Pulumi does not really give a real advantage. Now, if Pulumi started 10 years ago and had a community that is as big as community of others, if it had as many examples and as much support and what's not as other solutions, then I would say, hey, why not? But Pulumi is a newer project that doesn't solve really any problem apart from allowing you to specify your infrastructure and something else, whatever that something is, whatever you would use it for, in a different way. And it argues that, hey, if you use JavaScript to define your state, that's better than a declarative format. I'm not sure about that. For me, Pulumi is an interesting project, interesting attempt that started on a wrong foot. It does not solve any problem in a better way, but just changes the syntax, how we define something. This video is probably going to get a lot of backlash. People are going to throw stones at me because people like Pulumi. But hey, that's what you get if you give an honest opinion, I guess. Anyways, thank you for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon, do all the things you normally do, and keep sending me recommendations what I should explore next. Pulumi is one of those. It comes from one of your comments. You asked about Pulumi, you got Pulumi. See you next time. Cheers.